Across the Western Front that winter, the cold took enough men out of the line to fill 3 divisions. Measured by fighting strength, the loss was closer to 12, because 9 in 10 of them were riflemen, and riflemen were only about a quarter of a division to begin with. Not from shell fire, not from anything that shot back, from weather that had been forecast in a sector that had been called quiet, against a condition the Army had already studied. That is the part worth sitting with. The lessons existed. They had been learned in Italy the winter before, and the volume that records them says so without softening. The thing was almost entirely preventable, given an honest look at the cause and hard command support behind the answer. The theater in Europe did not profit from them. So this is not a story about the battle. The offensive is in it the way weather is in it. Something enormous happening above you while you are busy with your hands. This is about the ground you had to open before you could lie down in it. About what you had on, and what had been ordered for you and had not come. About the boots that were the wrong boots, and the few hours of warmth somebody had to pull you back to before you could sleep at all. Tonight you are going to spend 1 day and 1 night in the Ardennes, in the last 2 weeks of December, 1944. It gets dark there early, before we settle in. If these have been helping you get to sleep, subscribing keeps them coming and it costs you nothing at all. And I am always curious where everybody is listening from. Leave your city and what time it is where you are. I do read them. Now get comfortable. I mean that literally. Straighten the pillow. Pull the blanket up over your shoulder. If one of your feet is cold, deal with it now, while you still can. Because for the next 2 hours, you are going to be somewhere none of that was available. We start before the cold, though, with the paperwork that decided how warm you would be. Most of what went wrong that winter had been settled weeks earlier at a desk. There was a word for you before there was a place for you. Until the 28th of December, 1944, the machine that moved you was called Ground Force Replacement Command. And a replacement is the thing that goes into the space something else came out of. On that date, the name changed. It became Reinforcement Command, the word borrowed from the British, and the reason entered in the file was morale. The letter that carried the change told the camps what to say out loud. New men were to be called a combat reserve, or reinforcements. They were not to be told what the older word had meant. Nothing else changed that week. Not the camps, not the trains, not the lists. One noun was retired and another was put in its place. Before any of that, there were the weeks. 8 to 15 of them was the standard for basic training before a man could be sent to a combat theater. And the same standard said that even then he was raw, and would need several more weeks of getting used to combat. That is the norm as written. The norm in December did not always agree. That time can be measured in minutes. Before November, the camps gave arriving men a lecture of half an hour on general health. 10 minutes of it went to the care of the feet, and the cold got 2 or none at all. Around the 1st of November, on another part of the front and in the same system, the lecture was doubled, and half the hour went to the cold. A circular in the middle of December turned that into a standing requirement. Instruction in the feet was part of the first orientation every arriving man was given, and beyond it he was to get an hour a week for as long as he stayed in the system. Teaching was done in small groups, with a demonstration and with every man practicing himself. Someone checked that boots and socks fitted. Then the paper caught up with the man. Depots were ordered to reassign nobody until he had been given the cold instruction, and until that fact had been entered on the card in his personal file. A second circular repeated the order in January. The verdict the medical volume passes on all of it is short, and is not a compliment. The measures were right, and they were taken far too late. You were not necessarily a new soldier. That autumn, the rear echelon was combed hard for men who could be turned into riflemen. Most of the new arrivals, one account of the season says, were reclassified cooks and clerks and truck drivers. The quota of such men owed to the infantry stood at 5,750 in December and at 17,700 by March. One man's route is written down in detail, and where it ends is the point. He went from a school for cooks and bakers to 17 weeks of infantry training and then overseas. He came ashore in Scotland at the beginning of November and was in the Hurtgen forest by the middle of the same month. That was the next forest north, not this one. Then the bag came out again. Before you boarded, the whole issue was laid out on the ground and someone walked the line with a list. It was called a showdown inspection, and it was done in the staging areas and at the ports of embarkation. What you were short of was not handed to you there. It was written on a shortage report, which is a document and not a pair of trousers. The far side of the water was a network of camps, and fitting them out went badly. British cots came over in quantity, along with British and Spanish blankets, already judged unfit for issue to combat troops, which is what the men passing through these camps were about to become. How many men stood in the pipe at any one moment was a number the theater kept for its own arithmetic. In the strength forecast made out for the end of February, a line marked reinforcements carried 85,000 men. They belonged to no unit. They were counted and fed and clothed as a category, and a category has a ration strength like anything else. What was supposed to happen to you in Europe was also written down. Every man arriving from the United States was to be given 2 or 3 weeks of training in the theater before assignment to a unit in combat. Military circumstance did not allow it to be applied evenly. During the Ardennes fighting, the same page says, very little time passed between a man's arrival and his assignment to a unit in action. The last leg ran on rails. Quartermaster mess teams built trial kitchen cars and wrote menus for feeding whole trainloads of men moving up. The same teams that had set roadside diners along the truck routes and opened the messes in the camps near Le Havre. Out of the window there were stores standing in the open along the shoulders of roads, on the towpaths of canals, and on airstrips. Between the 16th of December and the 2nd of January, the American divisions in the Ardennes took in 31,505 men to fill themselves out, or reinforcements, as the history puts it, as these individual soldiers now were named. A man who came up before Christmas was a replacement. A man who came up after the New Year was a reinforcement. Nothing about him was different. Arrival itself was short. At the regiment service company, somebody took away most of what was called excess equipment, then a walk of about a mile to a group of dugouts, and there the companies were handed out and the names and serial numbers written down. A guide took the party forward. Men came up in small, frightened bunches, and a company counted it an achievement to bring a batch in whole. What a sergeant of one regiment could do in the middle of a fight was to tell each new man to remember his platoon number, to get into the nearest hole, and to move when the others moved. That was the induction. The word for you had changed twice in one winter. The whole had not. The road you came up on had a wall of trees on either side of it, and for the length of the drive that was the country. It is not. Behind the wall, the land opens out again and keeps doing that all the way across. Forest and clearing and forest. The two walls belong to the road, not to the place. Everything here is arranged along roads, and your hole is somewhere off one of them. This country is not what the name suggests. It is not mountains, and it is not a forest either. The historian of the campaign calls it a broad plateau, with elevations rising out of it as ridges, and he adds that the ridges have no connection with one another. Holding one gives you nothing on the next. About a third of the high ground carries trees, and most of them are conifers. The woods lie scattered in a patchwork rather than in great blocks, dense stands alternating with clearings, some natural and some cut. Fighting in such a place breaks into small, separate affairs. So does everything else. Roads here are better than the population explains. The Belgians and Luxembourgers had worked out before the war what motor tourism was worth and built for it. The main roads were hard-surfaced, usually macadam, and the bridges were stone. Where the ground allowed it, the road followed a ridge or a valley. Where it did not, it swung hard and dropped. 10 all-weather roads led out of Germany into Belgium and Luxembourg along that frontier. Not one was a trunk highway running straight from east to west. The main roads ran north and south, across the direction an army coming out of Germany would take. One exception cut the massif diagonally. Military routes of movement in this country, the history says, regardless of weather, are identical with the road net. That sentence is the whole geography in one line. Off the roads, movement is restricted even in good conditions. So the ridge road is not a convenience, it is the terrain. The junctions have the names that matter here. Monchaux, Saint Vite, Bastogne, Arlon. There are no towns. The largest villages held between 2,500 and 4,000 people, and the ordinary one is a cluster of stone houses on narrow, crooked streets that squeeze the road you are on down to single file. Sometimes there is no village at all, only a farm or an inn that has given its name to the crossroads it stands on. Water cuts the plateau into compartments. The streams zigzag, and in places run through gorges with walls 100 to 300 feet high, so that even the wide valleys are narrow by West European standards. 3 are too tight and winding for a road at all. East of St. Vite, the ground rises into a wooded hogback called the Schnee Eifel, crowned along most of its length with the concrete of the west wall. If you were up on that crest, you were sitting in a German pillbox taken in the autumn. Since many of them were blind, the real line was the holes dug around them and the belts of wire the battalion strung itself. North of there, the same upland runs on into a plateau of lakes and bog, and beyond that, into the Hurtgen forest. The wood the divisions had come out of and the wood they were resting in were two ends of one massif. What this sector was for had been written out as a list of verbs. The corps holding it was to train, to rest, to refit, and to watch the enemy. It took no part in the December offensives further north. 2 of its divisions had been worn thin in November. The 3rd had come straight from the United States. That does not make it a dumping ground, and the history takes trouble to say so. This was not Blighty in the soldier's sense of home and safety, nor a haven for second-rate troops and poor commanders. The 2 worn divisions had distinguished themselves in the Hurtgen, and those men were the ones best able to teach a newcomer anything. So the tired and the green were not 2 different units. They were the same regiment, One stood at nearly full strength on paper in the middle of December, and a great many of the men in it, and some officers, had yet to see their first action. Another division was still 500 to 600 short in each regiment. Everything else was worn in the same proportion. Rifle companies stood at no more than half strength in many cases, and equipment had been in use since Normandy. 3 divisions in this condition held a front of about 85 miles, which is roughly 3 times what the American service schools allowed a defending force of that size. The positions themselves came furnished. The veteran division that handed over the northern part of the line had roofed its forward squads in with log dugouts and run telephone wire out to nearly every post. Machine guns and mortars were left standing in their emplacements and handed over on the spot, so that the relief would not show itself to anyone watching from the other side. Watching from your own side was the day's work. In one regiment sector, the record of those weeks is a single sentence. Men on the observation posts watched the enemy going about his daily routine and logged the occasional mine or shell. Outposts on the riverbank were manned by day only. At night, the strip of ground between the ridge and the river belonged to nobody, and patrols from both sides went into it looking for each other. Quiet did not mean empty. It meant that the same things kept happening and that the list of them was short. It also meant school. The German division opposite let one American regiment run its training program with only the smallest interference, week after week. Men went back in rotation as well. Veterans drew leave to Paris or to Ardennes, and a few got as far as the United States. The rest of the rotation gave you a few hours in the city of Luxembourg. There was ice cream in several flavors, beer that had been watered heavily, and the doubtful pleasure of hearing accordion players squeeze out German waltzes and American marching songs left over from the other war. The divisional rest houses were later moved forward to sit behind the regimental command posts. Nobody in the chain of command expected more from the enemy here than local attacks and raids, and patrolling did not change the estimate. The sector had been still since September. One cavalry squadron had held the same positions in the gap north of the Schnee-Eifel since the 19th of October, close to 2 months in one set of holes, and the line itself was strung on a road. A continuous front was out of the question over 9 or 10 miles, so one regiment held a chain of stone villages instead, along the ridge between 2 rivers, and the one you were in held about a company. An excellent highway runs the length of that ridge. The soldiers called it Skyline Drive. The villages sat 1.5 miles to 2.5 miles back from the river, with the highway threading them together and 4 side roads crossing it, climbing from the water and dropping again on the far side. The river below was in places no more than 40 feet wide and could be waded. Between its 2 walls of trees, the road ran on. Nothing new came up it for weeks. The winter did not begin with frost. It began with water. On the Third Army front, October brought rain on 28 days out of 31, and the fine weather that had held since the landings broke that month and did not come back. By November, the flooding was general. Fields and roads soaked through, ditches and streams over their banks. You are on the plateaus of the Ardennes and the Eifel, and the water is not an accident of that year. Much rainfall, deep snow in winter, raw, harsh winds over the high ground. That is the stand-in description of this country, and its heaviest rains fall in November and December. Men came up here wet. Only after that did the cold arrive. Nothing here forecasts well. These hills lie on the seam between the northwestern and central European climate zones, where Atlantic air meets air moving west out of Russia. What that seam gives is not one winter, but a sequence of them. From the 1st of November to the 20th of December, the daily mean along the western front ran at about 40 degrees, and the minimum only occasionally dropped below freezing. 7 weeks of winter, and almost none of it was frost. It was cold water instead, standing in the low ground, running in the ruts, held in the wool you have on. Fog is the second of these environments, and it is also normal here. The mists of these hills are frequent and heavy, and hold well into late morning before they break. On the morning of the 16th of December, ground fog lay along an entire division front, and men on a road could not tell whose road it was. Visibility has numbers, and the numbers are small. Below Bastogne, a low clinging fog brought sight down to something like 75 feet. At about 1 in the afternoon, a December fog came down over a village in the hills, thick enough that the account calls it soup. The date of the offensive was chosen for exactly that. German meteorologists looked for a stretch of at least 10 days of bad weather and poor visibility, so that aircraft would stay on the ground. The window they found fell on a new moon as well. The fog around you is not luck. It was on somebody's calendar. Frost, when it came late. For a few days before the 16th of December, the weather turned extremely cold. The first real cold of the season, 7 weeks into a winter that had so far been rain. On the 18th, an anticyclone came in off the Atlantic and took it away again. Tanks bogged. The dense ground fog began to tear. 2 days later, the high ground started to freeze in patches, and the roads went half slick and half mud, the same stretch both at once. The 22nd was a collision. Eastern air and Atlantic air met over the same ground and gave snow, blizzard, fog and rain inside a single day. North of the line, rain and mud. South of it, fog and snow. On the 23rd, the wind changed, and that is the turn of the season. Cold, dry air came out of the east. The sky cleared, and a hard freeze set in for 5 days. The ground went solid under it. In the hills of the Eifel, the same wind drifted snow across the roads until movement very nearly stopped. Clearing was not only a gift. The fog had been cover, and that morning men and weapons stood visible again on ground blank for days. Here is the measured bracket of that freeze, taken across the combat front in Europe. Between the 19th of December and the 31st of January, the average daily maximum was 33.5 degrees, and the average minimum 22.5, not 20 below zero. A little above freezing by day, about 10 degrees under it by night, 6 weeks without a break. Something in those weeks ran the other way, though. The wet disappeared. Water that had stood in every hollow since October was locked up solid, and the thing that had been doing the damage all November simply stopped working. The freeze was drier than the rain had been. Cold, dry, and hard underfoot. Snow comes later here than the picture suggests. The deep snows of the Ardennes arrive late, the rule of the place, not a note about that one year. Around the 19th and 20th of December, this country was cold and frozen with no snow on it at all. First flurries, then the ridges showing white, then the cover thickening across a few days. The night of the 21st brought the first heavy fall, and the morning of the 23rd came fair and clear and freezing together. What falls here can put down 10 to 12 inches in a day, and it lies long and moves under wind. At the end of the month, Arctic air came out of Scandinavia with blizzards, and almost no visibility at ground level. January is where a division, a week and a thermometer finally appear in the same sentence. In Belgium, in the first half of that month, the temperature at times fell to 13 degrees. On the opening day, snow and sleet and rain came down together. In the hills, the snow stood knee-deep, the roads iced over, and the trails through the woods stopped being visible. Water froze in the canteens and in the rations. A full canteen would go part solid overnight and thaw back through the day. And that is your drinking water, all of it. Fog on that ground closed to 30 or 40 yards. Supply came forward only in half-tracks, and the last of the way in men's hands. Metal is not taken with a bare hand in weather like that. The medical record states the rule flatly. Unprotected skin against cold metal and such cold needs no time at all. So the glove stays on, and the work is done through it. Engines had the same trouble in another form. On the 17th of December, cold motors and congealed transmission grease held a German column near Schönberg down to about 15 miles an hour. Light armor sent forward at the end of that month could make no headway on the icy roads at all. Wind is the last of these and the least recorded. The winds over these plateaus are described as raw and harsh, a standing feature rather than an event. Any movement of air at all, even under 5 miles an hour, strips away the still warm layer your clothing is holding against you. How that felt was never measured. Wind chill was not recorded in the European theater at all. The term came out of Antarctic observation, and the tables built from it were meant for the Arctic, not for a temperate winter, because they took no account of wet. Nobody stood in that wood with the instrument. What this ground can be counted on for is days. Stavelot averages 112 days of frost in a year. Bastogne, higher up, 145. Set against 30 years of European weather, this winter went into the record as the wettest as well as the coldest. The cold began to let go in the last days of January. On the 1st of February, the thaw arrived, and by the early part of that month, the frost had gone almost entirely, and wet cold was the main factor again. The winter did not end in warmth. It ended in water. What came first came back. 2 hours to break the crust. 5 hours to get 3 feet down. Those are the figures for a division working in Belgium in January. They are not a complaint. They are the rate of the job. The frost had gone into the top of the ground and set it, and the record calls the shelter problem of those days critical. The medical volume lays the question out as a single scale. At the bottom is no shelter at all, open ground. Then a foxhole scratched out in the dark and never improved. Then a foxhole somebody had time to work on. Higher up come tents and dugouts, then concrete and damaged buildings, and at the top, a whole building fit to live in. Where you land on that scale is not decided from inside the hole. The volume is blunt. Shelter in combat is a function of the tactical situation, and terrain has a vote, but not the deciding one. A man who got into a building, a cellar, or a dugout could see to himself. A man who spent the night in a foxhole, opened at dusk, could not. The crust beat men who knew their trade. On Christmas Day, near Emerul, German grenadiers tried to dig in, found the ground frozen past working, and lay down in the snow instead. The same earth stopped both sides. Nothing about it was a matter of effort. That crust worked in the other direction too. Near Schaan, the frozen ground gave tanks good going where mud would have held them. The freeze was a road surface and a locked door at once. Under fire, the arithmetic does not improve. At the end of December, an armored infantry battalion caught in the open dug furiously in the frozen ground. And furiously is the word the account uses. A quartermaster observer in Tunisia had already stated the rule for the theater. When a foxhole is wanted, it is wanted fast and deep. What you work with comes off a table of allowances, not out of any account of these woods. Into the war the soldier carried entrenching gear of the 1910 pattern, an axe, a pick-matic, and a shovel 22 inches long. From 1943, there was a folding shovel copied from a German one, its blade locking at a right angle to work as a mattock. The supply service graded its own item without flattery. A good mattock, an adequate shovel, and a poor axe. The one thing these sources do not contain is the picture. There is no scene anywhere in these volumes of an American soldier swinging a pick at frozen Ardennes ground, no crowbar, no charge laid to open the earth. Demolitions in these books are bridges and roadblocks. The hours are recorded, and the tool is not. 2 hours and 5 hours stand in place of the picture. A foxhole in a wood is not finished when it is deep. In the forest fought over just before this winter, the first thing a replacement was taught was that a foxhole meant very little unless it was roofed with logs and sod. The reason is overhead. Guns were laid so that shells burst in the crowns of the trees. What comes down from a burst in the crown comes down as splinters onto the forest floor, into the one place an open foxhole does not cover. The second half of the same lesson was for men caught outside, not flat on the ground, but standing or crouched hard against a trunk, showing the smallest surface upward. Roofing costs daylight, and daylight is what there is least of. In the last week of November, fire kept one division from cutting its logs, and dark came with the foxhole still open. A week earlier, another halted its attack early, to be dug in and covered before the light went. In these hills the same held. At St. Vite on the 21st of December, one combat command took the heaviest shelling it had yet seen, and the bursts in the crowns reached down into the foxholes it was holding. The wood does not stop that kind of fire. It supplies it. Shape is one of the few things left to choose. On the 20th of December, in Marvey, outside Bastogne, when the evening went quiet, the men dug narrow and very deep and set their foxholes tight against the foundations of the houses. A wall already standing in the ground is one side you do not have to cut. Underfoot there is a second problem, and it is not the one this winter hands you. In December, the theater newspapers put it to the soldier in his own language. Modernize your foxhole if you can, and put a floor in it. The "if you can" is doing the work in that sentence. Water in the bottom belongs to the lowlands and to autumn. In flat country, the volume admits the thing was unsolvable. A foxhole deep enough to be worth digging was a foxhole that filled. Where the ground is hills and frozen through, the position is dry and hard, and depth stops fightin' with dryness for as long as the freeze holds. How far away the next foxhole sits is arithmetic done above you. On the 22nd of December, one division held a line 12 miles long, and the positions along it went in at intervals of 150 yards. At that spacing, you cannot see the man beside you, and in a wood full of snow you will not hear him either. Given a quiet sector and time, the same work becomes something else. On the northern shoulder, a battalion held 1,000 yards of foxholes along the eastern edge of a village and backed them with covered support positions. It had been building for about 6 weeks. That is the ceiling. 6 weeks of a static front, turned into overhead cover. An official photograph from that winter is captioned as the construction of a winterized squad hut near the front lines. A hut for a squad, then, was a recognized object and not somebody's private idea. On the Schnee Eifel before the middle of December, one division had log dugouts for its rifle and machine gun squads. Concrete was lying about and mostly was not worth much. In one regiment sector, the German line had been broken through and occupied, but most of the pillboxes were blind. The embrasures faced the wrong way, and the defense rested on the foxholes and wire the battalion put in itself. Concrete gave a roof. It did not give a position. Cellars appear in the record as places of work. A company command post in one, a radio operator sitting out at night in the cellar of an abandoned battalion post, while the fighting went over the top of him. Whether anyone slept down there, the sources do not say. The top of the scale is a village, and by the last week of December, villages were fought for as exactly that. Around Bastogne, the thing pressing hardest on commanders was getting men under a roof. In a white landscape, the only other light cover was a plantation of firs. And the fighting came down to a few houses or a line of trees. Where there is no village, the arithmetic comes back to where it started. 2 hours to open the ground, 5 hours to be 3 feet into it. The ground is the same for everyone standing on it, and it does not care which way the line faces. You get into it or you lie on top. What the theater planned to put on you this winter was a list, and near the top of that list stood a short wool jacket. 4,259,000 of them were asked for in March, to be delivered inside the year. It is the one item, the one to hold on to while the rest goes past. It is the layer that is not there. Warmth, in the design behind that list, is not a property of cloth. Your body makes the heat. The clothing only holds a shell of warmed air against your skin and keeps the outside air from carrying it off. And in still air, the warmth equals the thickness of the insulation. Everything else follows from that one sentence. Still air is what the outer garment exists for. Wind washes the warmed air straight out of loose wool, so the shell is a light, tightly woven cotton, with the insulation living underneath it. The principle came out of Arctic practice, from men who had given up fur for loosely woven wool under a windproof top. Wool holds a great deal of water without ever feeling saturated, and that is why it sits next to you. Layers were meant to move with the weather and with how hard you are working. Cold, and you add one. Sweating, and you take an inner one off at the first chance. Sweat makes you colder, because damp clothing spends your body heat drying itself instead of warming you. And dirty clothing is colder than clean. Nothing in cold weather is supposed to fit closely. A field jacket that sits well over a single wool shirt turns tight in winter, when a sweater or a wool jacket has to go underneath, and the extra layer then makes you colder by pressing on the blood in your arms. One pair of loose gloves is warmer than 2 tight pairs. 3 different jackets are in Europe this winter, and they are not versions of each other. There is the old field jacket, issued since before the landings. There is the short wool jacket the theater wanted, cut on a British pattern. And there is the new field jacket, the windproof cotton shell built to carry everything else beneath it. Headquarters in Europe did not want the new one. It was accepted there for parachute troops and almost nobody else, and the final decision to take it as a replacement was not reached until the 10th of November, 5 weeks before the German attack. By then the reason had become plain. The overcoat was bulky, it shed no water, and men threw it away in a fight. Commanders had argued the other way for months. The Army Group and the First Army held that the overcoat was necessary for warmth, and that the wool jacket with a sweater under it was the better combination, and the Supreme Headquarters agreed. So the garment everybody had settled on was the garment that still had to cross an ocean. 500,000 wool jackets were due out of New York that September. By the 13th, 116,000 had reached the port, and 14,000 had been put aboard ship for Europe. Measured against what the theater needed when the cold arrived, the shortage came to more than 1 million. Large lots landed in January and February, and in combat, they were hardly issued at all. Planning for winter clothing had been built on an official forecast of where the armies would be, and the forecast was badly wrong. It assumed nobody would reach the Ardennes or the Vosges, the wet, cold, low-mountain country where special clothing is needed, before May of 1945. For a winter fought in western France, what was already on hand looked entirely sufficient. Belief helped the delay along. A good many people in the theater expected the war to end before winter combat clothing was needed at all, and expected the next requirement to be a dress uniform for an army of occupation. That mood grew through the summer. Before Paris fell, transport settled the rest of it. Moving winter clothing forward was treated as a problem of shipping rather than of manufacture. Down a pipeline running more than 400 miles from Cherbourg to the armies with no depots along the way. Airlift was asked for and refused because fuel and ammunition held the priority. The Army Group commander backed that refusal and set it down afterwards without softening. During the drive to the Rhine, he had deliberately passed over winter clothing for ammunition and gasoline, and called it a bad guess. Standard items were not the shortage. Underwear, wool shirts and trousers, overcoats, field jackets and gloves were in the theater in sufficient quantity through the whole season, and it was the special cold weather items that were scarce. What failed was the last stretch of the journey. The thing existed in the theater and was not on the man. 9 pounds is what an overcoat weighed dry and packed, the heaviest single garment on the whole list. Every soldier in Europe had been issued one. There was also a standing complaint from the top that men on the line shed heavy clothing during fast movement, overcoats first of all, and that those losses at times ran very high. Improvisation covered the gap in 2 documented ways. Men wore 2 sweaters instead of 1, or they cut a piece of blanket to shape and sewed it inside the lining of the new field jacket. The sweater and that jacket alone did not hold heat in severe weather, and the Army said so plainly. Sweaters were the bottleneck of the entire winter. They were promised out of New York by September, in a quantity that did not exist until the end of January. Without a sweater under it, the new field jacket was not adequate winter protection, even in a mild zone. There is a limit written into the design itself. Combat clothing is not built for extremes. It is built for the average weather of the coldest months, with a margin of roughly 10 degrees either side. Air has to sit between your skin and the first layer, and between every layer after that. Past the margin, the arithmetic simply stops. Gloves carried a fault nobody could design around. Knitted gloves with a leather palm were reported unsatisfactory in wet snow for the plain reason that a man in a forward position has no way to dry them, and wool mittens with a removable leather shell were going out as the replacement. Drying, not warmth. was the thing that failed. White was a layer nobody had planned for at all. Fresh snow near Bastogne on the 23rd of December threw every dark object into full relief. German grenadiers went over to white capes, and their armor was painted white. The American answer was a raid on Belgian bed linen and a bucket of whitewash for the vehicles. Some units reached the fighting with nothing to layer at all. The airborne division that moved into Belgium left more Milan in 380 trucks, carrying 11,000 men, with individual equipment lost in Holland and never made good, and its stocks well below the tables of allowance. Through its first days at Bastogne, it was short of clothing. So you stand in what actually got to you. Wool underwear, a wool shirt and wool trousers, a sweater if one came, and over that an overcoat or a field jacket of one of the older kinds. The short wool jacket ordered in the spring is in a warehouse, or a hold, or a queue at a pier. You are wearing the difference. A second pair of socks belongs inside your shirt. That is not a habit somebody worked out in a hole. It is written down. A War Department circular in the summer told you to wear wool socks in combat and carry spare pairs on you, and told your unit to bring clean, dry socks forward daily. The wording is an order, and disciplinary action is named in it. What the table of allowances puts on your feet is a pair, a service shoe or a combat boot, with an Arctic overshoe pulled over it. Washington called that combination the most satisfactory available for this theater, and through December, it refused to replace it with anything else. Whether the second half of the pair reached you is the rest of this chapter. What the combination was not built for, in any case, was standing in water without a break. Leather is permeable, and there is no such thing as a waterproof leather boot. However it is built, water comes in through the seams. Grease dressing does not stop that and slows the drying afterwards. So there are only two ways out: a rubber overshoe over the boot, or a rubber bottom boot instead of it. Winter footwear of that second kind has already been ordered for you. The Army calls it a shoe pack, a rubber foot, leather top, 12 inches high, packed with 2 felt insoles. 446,000 pairs went into a requisition in August, figured as the supply of one field army. That number is a requisition and later a shipping figure. It is not a count of feet. First issue to the 1st, the 9th and the 3rd armies did not happen before the end of January. On the 23rd of December, when the theater asked again, troops supplied out of the communication zone had been given none at all. So through these nights, the winter boot is the thing that is traveling, and what you have is the boot and the overshoe. Overshoes are short as well, and the shortage is measurable. In October, a theater report put it at 60% of troop strength and called the position disturbing. By the middle of November, the 3rd Army held 1 pair for every 4 men. 9 divisions were still partly equipped in December. Sizes made it worse. 1 corps was 11,000 pairs short in the large sizes alone. They were also the item men got rid of. Before an attack, overshoes were ordered off for the sake of movement. Armored infantry had half tracks to bring them up afterwards. Ordinary infantry had nothing, and overshoes left behind were usually gone for good. Military police and anti-aircraft gunners went short too, and their work is standing still for hours. Upstream of it was a decision at the ports. Overshoes were taken off troops at embarkation in the States, on the theory that they would be reissued on the far side, and the reissue did not work. The policy changed only in the middle of January. Socks are the other half of the arrangement. A heavy wool sock is worn in the field, a spare pair is carried, and everything after that comes by daily exchange when a unit stands more than a few days in wet cold. Cotton socks are a garrison issue. Enough was reckoned at no fewer than 3 pairs a man. One qualification runs through all of it. 2 pairs help only if the boot was fitted over 2 pairs to begin with. If it was not, the second pair presses, and a measure meant to keep the foot warm does the opposite. Footwear is to be chosen loose enough that a heavy wool sock does not bind. The dry pairs went forward the same way in every army. Fresh socks travel with the daily ration. You take the dry pair when you take the food, and hand back the wet, dirty one in exchange. Salvage crews at the ration dumps issued against the morning report strength and collected what came back. Laundry units carried the load behind that, working through the ration system rather than the clothing exchange, and sometimes driving socks out to the division supply points themselves. One clothing exchange point turned 5,000 pairs of socks in a day. Inside a regiment, it looked smaller and more exact. Spare barracks bags were drawn for every company, and the socks lived in them. Requisitions were written for size 12 and nothing else, because size hardly matters here. The ration party came up at night, took away the bags of wet wool, and left 1 dry pair for every man on a 48-hour cycle. That commander put the principle in one line: if you can get food to men, you can get socks to them. He wanted 1 man in the company answerable for it, preferably the mess sergeant, who was hauling the food anyway. 10 basic points about the feat were printed on a card, and every man was to carry his own. Company officers checked for the cards. The penalty was domestic and precise. A man caught without his card was struck off the list for a pass to Paris. Standing in water is forbidden by the same routine. Where it can be done, water is bailed out of the hole, and you stand on stones, on pieces of wood, on cut branches. If you have to stand a long time, you work the feet. Toes inside the boot, the ankle bending, the whole foot when there is room for it. This is where the pair inside your shirt does its work. The dry pair goes on, and the wet one takes its place against your body. And by the time you need it again, your own heat has done the drying. The whole arrangement runs on nothing else. The theater's senior medical officer reduced the whole business to 3 actions. Boots off once a day, rub the feet hard, wring the water out of the wet socks before they go back on. In the Ardennes, the record is thin and very concrete. At Bastogne on the 23rd of December, a civil affairs officer walking the town found 2,000 burlap bags in a civilian warehouse among the food stores, and they went out to the infantry holes to wrap feet where overshoes had run short. In one green division that had just relieved veterans, the last regiment drew its overshoes on the 15th. Weather closed the rest of the argument. On the southern shoulder on Christmas Eve, the thermometer stood below 20 degrees. And where an attack crossed streams running with melted snow, dry feet were not available at any price. Replacements were arriving with no instruction about cold at all. What the whole effort was worth was argued in supply terms, and the quartermasters carried the cost of the winter into that argument as their opening number. 9 in 10 of the men it took were infantry riflemen, and riflemen were the part of a division that could not be replaced out of the rear. And the answer they finally gave themselves was not footwear at all. The 7th Army had the rubber-bottom boots 2 months ahead of everybody else and showed no better result for it. And in March, the theater quartermaster and the chief surgeon wired Washington that the footwear was far from the most important factor. What could be managed was the routine. A dry pair carried warm, changed once a day. If your division drew them, you lie in a blanket that has been sewn into the shape of a man. It closes with a zipper 30 inches long, and over it goes a cover of water-repellent cotton sateen. Getting into it is easy. Getting out in the dark, in everything you own, is what was argued about. One observer's verdict was that the bag suited everyone except the men in the most forward foxholes. Bedding in this theater is counted in blankets. The item in the supply list is a blanket, wool, olive drab, and everything else you sleep under converts into blankets before it is counted. One sleeping bag with its cover was rated the equivalent of 2. That rating is the unit of account. 4 was the working figure for winter. On the 14th of September, the chief quartermaster of the theater put it in a single line. The troops need 4 blankets now, and he had to get them. That was not a request for something extra. It was a request to restore something already taken away. The authorized issue of 4 blankets had been cut to 2, on the expectation that an improved sleeping bag would cover the difference. Because of that decision, not one blanket was shipped from the United States to this theater in August or in September. The bags then ran 54% behind what had been promised for October. By the first days of October, the First Army had about 6,000 new sleeping bags for each of its divisions. That was enough to give every man one of 2 things: 4 blankets, or a bag, and 2 blankets. Which of them you are holding depends on what your division drew and when it drew it. Neither was handed over a counter. At the Army depot that opened in Belgium on the 5th of October, sleeping bags stayed on the list of controlled items issued against an allotment. At the end of October, more than 1.5 million bags stood off the beaches in ships that had not been unloaded. Cut narrow, the bag is a mummy, made from the autumn before of napped woven wool of 21.5 ounces. The same cloth, by weight and by strength, that goes into an army blanket. There is no down in it anywhere. The written requirement for it is short: maximum insulation for the least bulk and weight. An outer shell that sheds water but lets the vapor of your body pass, since otherwise it collects inside, and, standing on its own line, that the bag be light enough for a man to get out of. The wool is army blanket wool, chosen for the property this winter runs on. It takes up water without going wet through. Making up the difference by weight was ruled out. The weight rides on a man's back. In the shipping tables, a blanket counts as 4.5 pounds. A bedroll is not a sleeping bag. The roll is 2 blankets wrapped around your kit, a shelter half with its pole and pins, a towel, a spare pair of shoes. Its place, by the tables, is on the vehicles of your unit. By the invasion plan, you carry what is on your belt and in your pack, and the rest travels behind you. Before boarding, each man turned in 2 of his blankets, and they stayed in a depot in England. Bedding is the one large thing a soldier holds that in a fight is not with him, which is why it can be lost while you are nowhere near it. On the 22nd of December, near a village southwest of Bastogne, a parachute regiment lost 15 trucks with its train, and almost all of its bedrolls went with them. The division those men belonged to had come into Belgium without sleeping bags at all. Much individual equipment was missing, the record says: overshoes, helmets, sleeping bags, and the like. On its own status table before it moved, Blankets stood below authorization and below requirement. Inside the town, the division collected what bedding the Belgian population could give it. That is on the record, and so is what came of it. Men were still severely cold at night and asking for blankets. The division quartermaster said so to the Corps on the 23rd and 24th of December. Elsewhere, it is simpler than a shortage. A lieutenant and 21 men, pushed out of a village in Luxembourg, came back to their line of foxholes without overcoats and without blankets. Out of another town, men reached the rear without weapons, without ammunition, without blankets or rations. Bedding stays where you were standing when you left. The reverse case is on the record, too. On the morning of the 28th of December, a counterattack by an American battalion found German grenadiers asleep in captured American bedrolls. Bedding changes hands the way ground does. What goes under you matters as much as what goes over you. And the Army manual says so outright. There should be as much insulation beneath a man as above him. Whatever lies under your body is crushed flat by your own weight and stops holding heat, so it has to be added to from below. Dry things were listed for the purpose: shelter halves, spare blankets, the packs and equipment you are not wearing, fiber boxes from rations or ammunition, plywood sheets, boughs and brush. Wet? None of it counts, and the manual is careful to say so. About 50,000 officers and men went through cold weather instruction in this theater by the end of the year. They were shown the handling of the sleeping bag and simple ways of keeping the body off wet ground. The importance of using such materials in foxholes at night was particularly stressed. One division printed the same instruction in its own newspaper on the 16th of December, in the language its men used. Fix up your slit trench if you can, and put in a floor of spruce boughs. The paper made a joke of the color. Under the joke is a floor of spruce laid between a body and the ground. Straw and boards worked when somebody carried them forward. A unit coming up to relieve another brought both, and laid them in the bottoms of the foxholes, the way duckboards were laid in the last war, and its men stayed relatively dry. On the German side of this same forest, straw was forbidden that month by order, because the horses needed it. Under the bag itself, the Army never put anything. No acceptable solution was found, the summary says. What existed instead was advice. Do not sleep in too much clothing because it binds your shoulders when you turn. Put the surplus under you. Move about briefly before you get in, so your body has heat to give the bag. If you are a small man, the bag is too large to warm quickly, and you are told to fold part of it under yourself. Less air inside to heat, more thickness below. It is the arithmetic of a blanket that grows no warmer for being doubled around you. The overcoat belongs here because men slept in it. When the theater argued against the short field jacket, the argument put forward was that the combat soldier slept in his overcoat, and a short coat leaves the legs bare. After the fighting, the zipper on the bag was lengthened to 70 inches. That is a direct answer to the complaint that a man could not get out of it in a hurry. Standardized after the winter it belonged to. Tonight the zipper is 30 inches long. In the first days of December, the higher headquarters of this theater authorized one additional tent with a stove in it for every company and every battery. The purpose written down for it was to dry clothing and to warm the men wearing it. One tent, one stove, one company. Fire forward of that tent is not forbidden outright. The rule is that heat was used on the front line when observation by the enemy did not forbid it. That is a condition, not a prohibition. Everything here turns on whether you can be seen. Shelter and concealment were one problem from the beginning. In the summary of that winter, cover is described as a way of cutting down exposure to the cold and exposure to enemy observation and fire. And the two stand inside a single sentence. What hides you also keeps the wind off you. There is a scale of cover, and where you fall on it decides what you may burn. Open ground, a foxhole scratched out in a hurry, a foxhole somebody has improved, a tent, a dugout, a cellar under a damaged house. A man who can get into a building or a dugout, the record says, is obviously far better able to look after himself. Through that winter on the Western Front, men worked out a great many expedients to improve their situation in even the crudest shelters. Often the same passage says, they obtained and used some form of heat even in the most forward positions. The expedients have names. A charcoal brazier is one. Heat tablets are the other. And the record notes that they give a fairly strong heat for their size. The brazier forward was not always private enterprise. One division's low cold weather figures were credited in part to unusual ingenuity in obtaining and issuing charcoal braziers to its frontline troops. Gasoline burns bigger, and it is the one that needs permission. When enemy observation allowed it, men poured it onto the ground or into containers packed with loose earth or sand, and set the fuel alight for warmth. The recipe is written down exactly. Gasoline poured on earth in an empty ration can gave an adequate, though smoky, source of heat. That is the whole of it, a ration can. A handful of dirt and fuel. It is not a fire anybody designed. Its prohibition is written down just as plainly, one sentence later. It could not be used in positions exposed to direct enemy observation. The same restriction covered the issue heating units that came with the rations. What burns shows. Many hundreds of gallons of motor fuel went that way over the winter. The record gives the figure not as waste by the men who burned it, but as evidence against an army that had not given men a practical means of warming themselves. By the book, heat came with your food and weighed almost nothing. To each sea ration there was to be one heating candle of 1.5 ounces, and the candle burns under the can, not for light. To the 10-in-1 ration went 4 candles of 3 ounces each, and in limited quantity, there was a can of solidified alcohol as a substitute. That is the whole official inventory of portable fire. And it exists to warm a meal rather than a man. For the K ration, no heating means were ordered at all. The reasoning was that surplus candles would accumulate at the issue points from the C rations, and a man could pick one up there if he wanted it. Experience, the record says, confirmed the ratio. Carrying a K ration, you formally have nothing to light. Judgment on the result is blunt. Both American types of heater, the summary of that winter says, were inferior to captured German heat tablets. It is a rare sentence, an army writing down that the enemy's version of a small object was the better one. The stove is the next size up, and it is a squad's item rather than a man's. The single-burner gasoline stove weighs 17 ounces, stands on folding legs and packs whole inside its own pan. Called a new and very desirable item for the squad in combat, it was consumed by demand as fast as it appeared. The entire stock went out on first issue, and nothing was left for replacement. It reached the troops in quantity only in the early part of the following year. What the stove was used for was recorded by a correspondent who watched it. Nearly every group of men at the front now has one. They warm their rations. They heat water for shaving, and if they are in a closed place, like a dugout, they burn it simply for the heat. He was not writing about this forest. 2-burner stoves stayed with the transport and were carried forward into a foxhole only when a position had settled. During an advance, no stoves and no kettles went forward at all. Improvised heating appeared, the record says, as the position became static. Anything that burns properly needs a pipe, and a pipe needs a roof. The cook stove for a company carries about 6 feet of sectional pipe above it. A pipe is why a stove belongs in a tent or a cellar, and why the foxhole you are in gets a candle. Fuel in the combat zone meant a petroleum product. The tent stove would burn heating oil, coal, or wood, but forward it was usually given oil, and the volume says why. Coal and wood were not principal items up front. Coal is a rear area allowance, and it is written as 1. In November, the allowance for troops in billets was set at 4 pounds of coal per man per day, with wood counted at twice the weight, and the instruction calls this a maximum that may be issued if it exists, not a guarantee. Hospitals had first claim. The theater bought stoves where it stood. 17,900 stoves suitable for heating tents were obtained in France by field purchase in a single month that autumn. In Italy that same season they were writing the same sentence. Warm clothing goes for nothing without the means to dry it. Rotation of one man is defined as taking him a few hundred yards back, into a dugout, a tent, or a cellar, for an hour or more of rest, dry clothing, and something hot. Command responsibility includes providing warming and drying facilities, and using them as often as is practicable. Where it worked, it looked like this: houses, dugouts, and tents immediately behind the line, and an hour out of every 6 or 8 for every man. That was another Army's division in another sector at the end of January. Here it did not. Of a division holding a defensive line through this winter, the record says the distinguishing feature of the period was not the fighting but the lack of shelter and the impossibility of rotating men in small units back into rest and warming points. Only at the end of January were its units pulled back and put into villages. Whether the extra tent with its stove ever stood behind your own company, the record does not say. What it does say is what came next. The sentence after the one authorizing that tent reports that the German counterattack in the Ardennes began, and that the First Army had the worst of it. The standard those tents were measured against is one line. A soldier should have the opportunity to warm himself and dry out at least once in 24 hours. That is the whole ambition. One tent, one stove, one company. Water freezes in your mess kit. That is not a figure of speech. In the first days of January, in the fighting for Bef and Devontav, the 84th Infantry Division set it down as an observation of that ground. Water froze in the mess kits, and it froze inside the rations too. What you are carrying is the K ration. 36.5 ounces of food, 46.5 once the packaging is counted, and it is not one parcel for the day. It comes apart into 3 separate boxes, named breakfast, dinner, and supper. Inside is a table of contents rather than a meal. Biscuits, processed cheese, a bar of chocolate, then the things that keep a man going rather than fed: soluble coffee, salted crackers, a lemon powder for water, and cigarettes in brands nobody was competing for. The chocolate bar in the supper box weighs 2 ounces. Field observation on how that ration is actually used says the same thing everywhere. The chocolate is taken, the coffee is drunk, the salted crackers are eaten, and the cheese holds up for about a week before it stops being touched. The rest is discarded, and the calculated nutrition of the thing goes with it. Beside it in the supply system sits the C ration, standardized before the war. 6 12-ounce cans, 3 of meat and vegetable, 3 of bread and coffee and sugar. The whole issue weighs 5 pounds 10 ounces. The complaints about it were the same complaints for years. Too bulky, too much food at once, too little variety. It was reckoned for no more than 72 consecutive hours. In the theaters, it was fed to men for as long as 90 days at a stretch, which nobody who designed it had allowed for. In freezing weather, it had one clear advantage over the K. The meat can could be warmed through in the can itself. Above both of them, on paper, is the 10-in-1, a ration for 10 men for 1 day, built for small parties working away from a kitchen, for tank crews and gun crews. It has to be cooked, and cooking is what a rifle company in a hole has least of. The last one is not a meal at all. The D ration is a bar of chocolate, sugar, and oat flour, 600 calories and 4 ounces. It was stabilized so that it would not melt at 120 degrees, a specification with nothing to do in this weather. 3 bars make the full ration, a reserve for a few meals, not food. Used as intended, it looks like this. At Lindyard, on the Siegfried Line, at the end of November, infantry going in on a night attack stripped down to what they could run with, and carried 3 chocolate bars a man and nothing else. That was another stretch of front and several weeks earlier, but it is the same winter and the same army group. Against the frozen mess kit there is exactly one remedy, and it is hot food brought up from behind. No standard procedure existed for that. It ran on the company cook and the battalion commander, and the quartermasters noticed that aggressive outfits tended to have aggressive cooks who got hot meals forward more often than anyone required them to. Mechanically, it worked in stages. The battalion kitchens stand in the rear of the battalion area. Hot food goes forward in insulated Marmite cans, hot drink in the same cans, or in a 5-gallon container wrapped in blankets. Quarter-ton trucks and trailers take it as far as the road allows. After that, it is carried, on foot, to collecting points agreed in advance. Distance mattered less than the drill. During an advance, the supply area could fall 5 miles behind the men, and hot food still arrived hot where the kitchen service was tight about it. Having the kitchen close was worth less than having the run exact. Cooks often walked the last stretch themselves. Then the German attack came through, and the effect on hot feeding can be read as a number. In First Army, the share of B rationed, kitchen food rather than field ration, stood at 82% on the 15th of December. By the 31st, it was 49. That is one army. Third Army, over the same weeks, held its B ration issue at 76% across the whole of December, and was feeding 100,000 more men at the end of the month than at the start. 2 armies, 2 stretches of the same offensive, 2 different Decembers. Where Third Army does show the cold plainly is in coffee. It burned 212,000 pounds of it in November. By January, it was burning 5 times that. And the climb had started the week the counter-offensive did. The week men began standing out in the open for long stretches. That is the arithmetic of the cup you are holding with both hands, counted for a whole army. Nothing in the supply plan expected that. 14 coffee roasters held in reserve on an island near Paris were put into emergency service, and commercial roasting plants in the city were taken on as well. The lesson the quartermasters wrote down afterwards is short. Requirements jump to an unexpected degree when troops operate in cold weather. Christmas at Bastogne was settled by arithmetic of the same kind. On the 24th, 160 aircraft dropped roughly 100 tons into the perimeter, and the 26,000 K rations in it covered the garrison for a little more than a single day. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy, and some of the transports came down in sight of the men on the ground. Before that, the division had been living off what the town held. An abandoned Corps bakery gave up flour, lard, salt, and a little coffee, and flapjacks became the favorite thing on the line. Potatoes, poultry, and cattle were requisitioned from farmers against later payment. A civilian warehouse produced margarine, jam, and more flour. By Christmas Eve, all of it was finished. The record closes the matter in one line, and the line is not a complaint. Christmas was a K-ration day for the men who had a K-ration. Elsewhere, the dinner was cooked and simply never reached anyone. One armored division ate its Christmas meal late, on the 31st. A combat command of another was in the middle of preparing a large one when the order came to move on Neufchâteau and then to Bastogne. Infantry taking Berdorf on the evening of the 25th found the cold remains of a German Christmas dinner. Underneath all of it runs a mechanism the supply doctrine states without drama. Field rations are compact and nutritious, and they become monotonous within days. Monotony costs appetite, lost appetite, costs intake, and a tired man eats less at the next meal than at the last. Fatigue and strain put the appetite down before hunger can push it back up. No one measured that in this forest. The nearest thing is from the first night of the defense of Bastogne, when stragglers coming in off the roads were handed K-rations. Some ate and asked where a weapon could be got. Some did not touch the food at all. So the mess kit stays what it was at the start of the night. A metal dish with ice in the bottom of it, waiting for something warm that may or may not come up the road. Sometimes it came, often it did not, and the box in your pocket was the whole of it. You ate the chocolate first. You see the steam before you see the tents. A bath point is 4 canvas tents pitched around a trailer. The trailer carries a boiler, and the tents are heated warm enough to stand in wet and undressed. The heat comes up off the canvas and stands over it in the cold air. The unit that runs it is small. A fumigation and bath company is 3 officers and 85 enlisted men in 2 platoons. Each platoon has a working section for the trailer and a supply section, and the supply section keeps a clothing exchange right beside the showers, so that washing and changing are one operation. Its shower trailer carries 24 heads, later raised to 36. The rest is canvas, storage for several thousand sets of clothing and portable lighting. The machinery is noisy. It has a silhouette that shows, and it weighs 10 tons and upwards, which ties it to surfaced roads. Combat quartermasters were unanimous about what they wanted instead. Smaller, lighter, easier to hide. Water decides where it stands. 20,000 gallons of clear water are wanted for every 16 hours the showers and the exchange run together, and each point needs a source for 3,000 men a day. Through the procedure, you move in one direction. You undress in a tent. What you are not exchanging goes into a bag with your valuables, and you take a tag. You are given a cake of soap. You wash. You take a towel at the far end, and you are dressed again from the skin outward. Underwear, shirt, trousers, and a field jacket if you need one. Regiments in this sector had been doing it that way since the autumn, close behind the line, as a production line. a dirty man in at one end of a tent or a requisitioned building, and a clean one out at the other. Capacity is where the arithmetic slips. A bath company could put 3,600 men through a 16-hour day, and a division through in a little over 4 days. With the division out of the line, the whole company working, the supplies on hand and the water there. It is a ceiling, not a count of men. Actual loading ran under half of it. Armies worked the units attached to them well below capacity for most of the campaign, and one army group's laundries averaged 42% over 11 months. The equipment was not the constraint. Priority ran the other way from you. Medicine had first call, salvage point second, troops in the field after both. Clothing sent to civilian plants in the rear ranked lowest. Placement followed from scarcity. An army that winter had 4 bath companies, and the quartermasters agreed afterwards that 7 would not have been excessive. Where possible, a platoon went to a division on the line. More often, one covered 2 divisions, while the other took corps troops and a third. A site equally convenient to 2 headquarters turned out to be far from both, and the service was seldom satisfactory. Laundry runs on the same shortage in a different shape. A semi-mobile laundry company is trailers it cannot move in one piece. So it cannot move in one piece. It shuttles forward in relays or borrows tractors. The sites it reached were usually too far back to serve anyone in contact. On paper, it serves 48,000 men a week, working 2 shifts and 7 16-hour days, and returns each of them a clean shirt, trousers, towel, undershirt, and drawers, about 5 pounds of laundry per man per week. Everything in that sentence is a table of organization talking. Schedules did not survive contact either. Laundries attached to corps could seldom establish a regular timetable. Units moved on short notice. The volume handed in matched no forecast. Rush orders arrived unannounced. One army concluded formally that the practical method was catch as catch can. What that looked like from the other side was written down in the neighboring sector by an artillery group keeping a diary of its attempts. On the 8th of December, the laundry company was packing to move and took nothing at all. On the 13th, it had more work than it could handle. On the 16th, it was serving 2 divisions. On the 18th, it accepted the bundles after considerable persuasion. 6 days later, the truck went back and the company had gone. The bundles lay in a field nearby. Out of 47, items were missing. 1 was gone entirely, and most of what had been washed came back dirty. That is Lorraine rather than here, and it is the only day-by-day account that exists. Where the system worked, it worked because the bundles stopped being personal. A laundry running forward onto a bath point had no sorting to do. It washed by the pound, and the exchange handed out whatever came up next in your size. One company serving the northern shoulder of this front held 121% of its rated capacity for 68 consecutive days. Its output over that run averaged 35,000 pounds a day. Another company in the same army, new to the work, managed 38%. The difference is not weather and not distance. It is whether there was an exchange stock at the far end. Steam comes back at the exchange in a form you would not expect. In the trailer stands a chamber that treats clothing under pressure at 252 degrees for a quarter of an hour. Almost nobody used it on clothing. It did blankets and mattresses instead, and it shrank wool badly enough that the chambers went to rear units. 6 per company were declared surplus in Normandy and sent to a salvage point, where they found steady work at last. Recovered garments, not obviously dirty, went through the chamber instead of the wash before reissue. The exchange point itself turned about 1,000 shirts, trousers, drawers, and undershirts in a day. Sizes were cut to 3, large, medium, small, because sorting 30 shirt sizes at a tent flap is not possible. Rear depots objected, forward units did not, and the volume explains why. A man who had not washed for weeks was unlikely to complain that clean clothes were loose and not his own. That sentence is the closest the record comes to saying how long you went unwashed. Nobody measured it. What is recorded instead is the ladder you climb to reach a bath. Out of the hole into a rough shelter a couple of 100 yards back. Then the battalion area. Then regiment. Then division. And somewhere along that line the bath and laundry facilities exist. Behind that, in towns out of ordinary artillery range, the rest centers eventually gave nearly every front-line man 2 days. That included a hot bath, a bed, and a film. When none of it was reachable, the arrangement the quartermasters rated most satisfactory of all was private. A local woman doing your washing for cigarettes, candy, soap, or rations. Once, here, it happened in daylight and by accident. At noon on the 22nd of December, when word went round Bastogne that German envoys had come in under a flag, the firing stopped, and men came up out of their holes and spent the hours shaving and washing. It is the only scene of its kind in the record of this battle. The history of the fighting says nothing else about washing. That silence is a measurement. How often your turn came round is simply not in the record. What is in the record is the steam, standing over canvas somewhere behind you, usually a long way behind you. You are standing ahead of the position, not in it, ahead of it, out where the ground belongs to nobody in particular, and the men behind you are using your eyes. The army had a word for the place, and the word was outpost. It is a location before it is a duty. How long you stand there, the histories do not say. They describe this winter in enormous detail. Which battalion answered for which stretch of river, which village held which road, and never once how many hours one man kept one post. Where the posts were is written down. How long a man stood on one was somebody else's arithmetic. 2 intervals are measured for this ground in this month, and both belong to movement rather than to standing still. The cavalry took over the Losheim Gap sector on the 11th of December. A small party from a tank destroyer company worked the seam in the line there every 2 hours, alongside the reconnaissance troops of the division to the south. Farther down the same seam, an infantry regiment's reconnaissance platoon held an outpost on a hill and ran jeep patrols out of it every hour, driving toward the cavalry patrols coming the other way. An hour and 2 hours. Those are the honest numbers of this place. And neither of them is a man in one spot. A regiment on the ridge between 2 rivers held a front of 9 or 10 miles that December, and a front that long cannot be a line. It was villages instead, each held at about the strength of a rifle company, with open country between them. Ahead of the villages stood the outposts. Those were 2 miles or so out in front of the garrisons, 5 of them to a battalion, on the near bank of the river. They were occupied in daylight only, and then by a squad. After dark, the strip between the ridge and the water became nobody's ground, and the patrols of 2 armies stalked each other across it. Set that against your own body. In this regiment, on these nights, no one stood forward of the line at all. The post held in the afternoon was empty by dark. What moved out there instead were patrols, and patrols do not stop. Elsewhere, the line was continuous, and the work of it showed. On the eastern edge of one village, a battalion lay in a line of foxholes 1,000 yards across, with support positions dug in behind. It had been working that ground for roughly 6 weeks. 1,000 yards of frozen line is what 6 weeks buys. North of there, a cavalry squadron held its sector dismounted, with 50 machine guns dug in behind mines and wire, and trip flares covering the approaches from the east. A wire strung across the dark is the one sentry that does not get cold, does not get tired, and never has to be relieved. What you do with your body out there was written down, and the paper is older than the winter. A War Department circular from the summer of 1944 reached this theater in September and went round again over the chief surgeon's signature in October. By December, it was standing policy here. Its instruction to a man who has to stand for long periods is exact. Exercise the feet and the legs frequently. Conditions may permit nothing more than wiggling the toes inside the shoe and flexing the ankle, and that much is still to be done. Where there is room, squat while standing, and raise the legs above the level of the body when sitting or lying down. None of that is about staying awake. The reason given for it is colder. Standing still was held to be as dangerous on this ground as the wet and the temperature were, and the prescribed remedy was motion. A man on a post moves because moving is the order. Staying awake is what the order does to him along the way. Loosen tight lacing and tight leggings at once, the same circular says, because tightness works against the blood. Bail the water out of trenches and holes wherever you can, and put something between your boots and the bottom of the hole. Stones, pieces of wood, cut branches, so that you are not standing directly in water. Whether men counted or talked or carried coffee out to the post is not written down. What is written down is the wire, strung across the dark, covering the approaches from the east, doing the one part of the job that never needed relieving. There is one measured fact about what a man on a post must not do. On the night of the 19th of December, patrols going out from a village had no difficulty finding the enemy. His outpost line was smoking and talking not more than 2,000 yards away. That is the range at which a voice and a lit cigarette hand over a position. Nothing about that failure is national. The rule runs both ways, and the men who wrote it down profited from somebody else breaking it. The discipline of a post is a short list of things not done, and the two the record actually names are talking and smoking. For a measure of the other kind of night, a battalion crossed a river in the dark after Christmas. The silence was broken only by the sound of oars, an occasional hoarse command, and a few rifle shots. That is the whole inventory. At 5:30 in the morning on the 19th of December, a column of half-tracks came up a road toward a roadblock outside a village. The outpost could not tell whose they were. The challenge went out 4 times before the leading vehicle ground to a stop a few yards short of him, and the voice that answered came back in German. 4 times is the detail that matters. A challenge is not one word thrown into the dark. It is a word repeated while a thing gets closer, and the range at which it gets answered is a few yards. There is no password in these histories and no countersign. There is a man in front, a sound coming on, and a decision made by ear. Earlier that same evening, the officer commanding had run his vehicles off the main street into the side roads. He detailed one officer to stand watch and told the rest to try to get some sleep. That is the only picture in the whole record of a watch being set. As doctrine, None of this was meant to last long on one man. The instruction was to pull men off the forward positions into anything with a roof a few hundred yards behind, regularly and by plan, unless the fighting flatly forbade it. The Army had its own evidence by this winter. The regiment that rotated men in small groups every day came through the month in better condition than its neighbors. The harder half of it is written down too. Rotation on any large scale was seldom possible, and every division on this front ran up against the same wall from its own side. The order said relieve the men. The line said there is nobody to relieve them with. So the outpost stays where it is, out ahead of the position, with the wire and the flares doing what they can. Your hour out there is not measured by you. It is measured by whoever walks out to take your place. And until he comes, the hour is not over. He comes when he comes. The first strange light of that winter did not come from your side of the line. Before dawn on the 16th of December, the German fire lifted along one sector and a glow rose in the east. The men watching reached for the only comparison available. They wrote that it was like artificial moonlight. That was a technique, and it had been tested. Germany built searchlights in quantity for the anti-aircraft batteries at home, and in early December the Western Command tried them in a ground roll, with troops and without. Broken country, the trials showed, could be lit widely in front of advancing infantry. Around 200 of the lamps were massed behind the attack front. They were switched on to lead the first waves in, and to light targets during the artillery preparation. They did it by throwing their beams up into the overcast and letting the cloud hand the light back down. Light arriving from a ceiling behaves differently from light with a source in it. An hour or so before daybreak, above one village on the ridge, 11 lamps came on together. Their beams reflected dully off the low cloud onto the ground where the defenders were lying. Nothing was aimed at anybody. The whole sky simply went paler. From this side, the first reading of the lights and the shell fire was that the enemy was making a demonstration. That reading held until German infantry appeared among the trees. Nothing of the kind was working on your behalf. 6 battalions of searchlight tanks had been shipped to Normandy, and in November, they were turned back into ordinary tanks. No operational requirement had been found. Whatever lit this ground came from the other side of it, or it burned. Mostly it burned. The job of lighting the battlefield was solved in part by houses and tanks on fire. Illuminating rounds from the light mortars had some local value, and the coordination a star shell needs to be worth firing was never achieved here. A shell over the woods is rare. A fire in a village is not. Flares were the ordinary business. In a quiet sector, the observers watched the enemy going about his housekeeping by day and wrote flares into the log at night the way you write down weather. A flare is fired to see with. Men put them up over the far bank of a river to work out why the shelling had started. The other use is to show something to somebody else. For nearly 2 hours one night, German flares methodically picked out targets for the mortars and the machine guns working behind them. Flares could also be asked for and not arrive. A crew that could not see 50 yards past its own muzzles called for light over the tanks in front of it, and none came. Light came down from above as well, dropped by aircraft along a road column. A regiment marching south by night found its road fitfully lighted by enemy flares. And fitfully is the word that matters. Snow is the second half of every light here, because snow absorbs nothing. A battalion crossing open slopes after midnight had every man outlined by moonlight, coming back up off the icy field. When a tank caught fire at a crossroads, the glare thrown onto the snow drew the infantry figures out of the dark. There is a phrase in the record for what this does. Movements etched by the light of flares and burning houses. Etched, not lit. In broken light on snow, the thing standing still goes away, and the thing that moves comes back, which is why the shadow is the part that matters. On one night that month, 3/4 of an hour after midnight, an attack went in under clear air and a full moon. As the men moved, long, grotesque black shadows trailed behind them across the sparkling snow. For the first few minutes, everything was quiet, and the word the account uses for it is beautiful. Men go toward shadow without being ordered to. Rather than work around the buildings in one village, those nearest the houses began edging inward, looking for shade and any kind of cover, and they drew 2 companies in after them. Shadow is not cover. It is the only thing out there that resembles it, which leaves the ears, and cold does not muffle this country. It opens it. Through the clear, cold air, the noise of tracks and motors could be heard for miles, and that is how the columns coming up toward the line were known about it all. Snow is no quieter than the air. A line of men attacking before dawn after Christmas was given away by the snow crackling underfoot. On a clear, frosty night before that, a group lying out heard a strange patrol coming by the crunch of it long before anything could be seen. They kept still and did not fire. How a thing walks is information. That patrol moved as though it knew the ground perfectly, openly, without creeping, and it went by the sentries on that account. Sound tells you there is something out there. Nothing in it tells you whose. The written record of these nights is largely a list of noises, horse-drawn vehicles and idling motors, carried to the post on the 14th and the 15th of December, and noted without alarm, because the same fuss had come with the last German relief. Tank movement at a village. One of those entries stops. At dusk, the garrison of a village radioed that half-tracks could be heard coming toward it, and that was the last message from it. Everything in the sentence except the sound is missing. The sound is what got sent. Not every night filled up like that. Toward midnight, in front of one battalion, everything was quiet except for the distant rumble of friendly artillery. And the word the men used for the quiet around their holes was frightening. That word is theirs, not the historians', and it is the only one of its kind in the record. What the dark does to the eye is not fear but error. A company reported figures in the half-light and peering into the ground fog that clung along the whole division front, could not tell whether Americans were coming through or the enemy was. Crews somewhere else saw figures moving in fog and took them for Americans. The dark also lasts. One village held out until about 4:30 in the afternoon, and then, as dusk gathered, 61 men went out across the snow. At noon that same day, there were still reckoned to be 5 hours of daylight left, which puts the end of the light near 5. Morning is later than the arithmetic suggests. Movement on the far side began at 5 and went unseen. A report timed shortly after daybreak carries the hour of 8:30. Daybreak does not finish the night either. The fogs here are frequent and dense and hang on until late in the morning. So the dark is when things move. Rail traffic and marches on the far side were confined by order to the hours of darkness. On this side, the relief of a regiment began as soon as darkness had settled. Vehicles ran through the villages without lights. Toward the end of it, the sky goes gray by degrees, rather than all at once. And the light that arrives is the same color as the ground. Until then, everything visible out there was lit by something burning, or by cloud handing back a beam somebody else had switched on. None of it was yours. You only had to see by it. There is an answer to how you sleep out here. And it is not anything you do inside your hole. It is a few hours in the warm, behind. Somebody takes you off the line, walks you back a few hundred yards, and for a while there is a roof over you. That is the mechanism. It is smaller than it sounds. Written down, the standard begins with one man rather than one unit. In forward areas, good rotation needs to be no more than the chance to get out of your own foxhole into a rough shelter a few hundred yards to the rear, where you can change your clothing, take a little exercise and see to your feet. A tent, a dugout, a wrecked building. The volume is honest about those places. Conditions back there were often nearly as severe as they were forward, and the difference was mostly the roof. You are not being taken somewhere comfortable. You are being taken somewhere with a lid. Further back, the ladder improves. In the battalion area, the care of your feet is better organized. In the regimental and division areas, better still. And somewhere along that line, there are a few hours of rest and, under ideal conditions, hot food. The word in the source is ideal, and it is doing work. Done properly, the thing meant small groups, a squad or more, taken out of the line for a few hours inside every 24 to 48 hours, which was also the rhythm on which battalions and companies were relieved where they could be. That is not a night's sleep. It is the difference between sleeping badly and not sleeping. No theater-wide policy on rotation existed at all. Divisions set their own, and inside a division the decision usually rested with the regimental or the battalion commander. So the practice varied widely from one outfit to the next. Whether you got those hours was not a matter of doctrine. It was a matter of who ran your battalion. Then comes the sentence that governs these particular weeks. During the German counter-offensive in December, the defensive operation in the first several days was so urgent that good rotation practice could not be carried out, and the same obstacle held through the American counterattack that followed. The prescribed way of sleeping existed. It was not available. None of it was new to the Army. In the Aleutians, a year and a half before this, one battalion had run the whole thing properly. Whenever it was possible, everyone, and the listening posts above all, came off for a few hours in the day to get dry and rest. It had been done, written up and filed. The other half of the answer is what a squad does in a village. Near midnight on the 18th of December, in Noville, the major commanding there put his vehicles down the side streets, posted a single officer to keep watch, and told the rest of the men in the village to snatch what sleep they could. The withdrawing traffic stopped at 4:30. German half-tracks came up before dawn. Nothing shows what tiredness did better than a stalled column at night. On the roads toward Bastogne, every time the traffic halted for a few minutes, drivers went to sleep at the wheel from sheer exhaustion. When the road cleared, the sleeping drivers made a new jam, and officers and military police spent the whole night walking the column and waking them. There was a right way to sleep, and it was published. Do not sleep in wet socks. That rule is older than this war. The medical volume quotes the same instruction, almost word for word, out of the manuals of the Napoleonic era. Boots come off. However cold it is, you do not sleep in your shoes, and least of all when shoes and socks are wet, because it interferes with the circulation and nothing gets a chance to dry. The line appears in the theater directive and in an order issued by direction of General Eisenhower. A rag or a spare shirt round the feet takes their place. Fewer clothes, not more. Many men make themselves cold by going to bed in too much clothing, which binds and cuts the circulation across the shoulders as they turn over in the night, and what comes off goes underneath you instead. A short bout of exercise before you lie down runs the blood and warms the bedding faster. Sleeping sitting up is allowed for, with a condition. If you sleep sitting, your feet are propped as high as you can get them. One regimental commander asked more. The moment his men reached shelter of any kind, they were to lie on their backs with their feet up, working their toes, and 30 minutes of that in a day, he reckoned, took care of most of the trouble. All of it was written by people who knew it could not be done. The same summary admits that socks cannot be taken off in actual combat, and that getting your boots off to sleep is realistic only in a bivouac or a rest area. In Italy that winter, the issue of bedding was rewritten to leave out the front-line troops, on the stated ground that men on the line slept in their boots. How much sleep any of this bought you is not recorded anywhere. Men in combat are chronically fatigued, the medical volume says, and the fatigue lifts only when they are taken out of the line and given the conditions to rest. Then it says the other thing, plainly. Under combat conditions, fatigue was not measured and could not be. What the record holds instead is the length of the stretches. The men of an infantry division in Belgium who took 2 villages in the first half of January had been in action 96 hours without a break. That is the whole of the figure. Nothing is written underneath it about what those hours contained. It came at the end of 13 days of continuous fighting in hard frost, after which the division went back near Barvaux, where the days of rest went on the vehicles as well. In the same passage, the history sets sleeping beside the digging and calls it no less serious a problem. For what the cold could reach on whatever part of you stayed bare. The nearest thing to a measurement comes from the next forest along, that same autumn. A staff officer wrote of one battalion that the men had fought without rest or sleep for 4 days, and that the night before they had lain in an open field with no shelter from the weather. Their hands were too numb to get their own equipment on, and they helped each other into it, which leaves the nights themselves, and they are thin. A diary entry for the first night of the offensive records that nobody could sleep. A week later, with reports of parachutists loose behind the lines, the anti-aircraft crews stood at their guns until morning and the infantry got little sleep. So the answer holds, and it comes in 2 halves. The warm hours behind the line were real, and they carried a man through the ones in front of it. How many of them reached you, and how much of that time you were asleep, nobody wrote down. The volume that ought to know says the measurement was never taken. You slept when sleep was possible. Somewhere behind you there is a truck that carries nothing but mail. One quartermaster company in a division lost 10 of its trucks to permanent detached duty. Most went to headquarters as vans, one to the purchasing officer, and one was detached for good to the nearest army post office to haul the division's mail. It never came back. That is what a letter costs at the near end. At the far end it costs tonnage. Through the autumn the armies here were cut back to what was absolutely necessary. And the record puts it plainly. Even the mail ate into the allotted tonnage. One army spent that season on a series of short, angry attacks, Instead of one long one, on that diet, personal things travel last, and the same rule shows in what did not arrive. By the end of November, there were no cigarettes at all in the rear areas, and the armies were down to 3 days' stock. Cigarettes were not a courtesy. They were an issue item, drawn free, and handed out with the rations when there were any. The chief quartermaster of the theater reported what the shortage actually was. Nearly 150 million packages were afloat, waiting in Britain or standing unloaded at the quays. He declined to ask a special priority to bring them forward, while combat rations and winter clothing were short. That is one man deciding, in writing, that your smokes come after your dinner and your coat. There were numbers on it while the ration held. In one army, the free issue ran at 1/3 of a post-exchange ration per man per day until the middle of September and 2/3 after that. And it held there until the German counter-offensive. December ends the series. The record stops giving a figure. Behind the truck stands an organization, and it belonged to supply. An army postal section was attached to the large quartermaster groups and worked the mail of every unit under them. In the tables, it sits in the same line as the service platoon in the finance section. Mail was not counted a form of communication. It was a service, like pay. One such group had close to 7,000 men in December, and at that size it could always keep its people in the ordinary personal services. The postal section existed because quartermaster units move constantly and change attachment constantly. Mail loses a man when the man moves, and a truck is how it finds him again. Even inside the ring, the paperwork went on. Among the personnel annexes of the Airborne Division holding Bastogne that December, filed beside the returns of the chaplain and the provost marshal, there is a post office report for the month. A division cut off from every road still rendered a monthly account of its mail. Where you read the thing is not your whole. The doctrine that puts a change of clothing and a few hours of rest somewhere behind the line puts the mail there too. Getting your mail and writing home are listed among what the rear areas provide, under ideal conditions. A letter is a rear area object. You open it where your hands work. Between the rear and you, the mail is freight, and freight can be lost. West of Bastogne, near a crossroads on one of the roads out, a company took a group of American trucks back off the Germans. Some held medical supplies. One was loaded with explosive, and one was loaded with mail. The explosive was put to use the same day on captured guns that could not be towed into town. What came into the town by air is listed, and mail is not in the list. On the second day of the resupply, about 160 aircraft came over and dropped until the middle of the afternoon, and the histories name the fuel, the rations, and the ammunition. They do not name letters. The lift itself was reported up as a tremendous lift to morale, which is another thing. Then the weather closed. Bad flying conditions on Christmas Day canceled almost every cargo mission into the pocket. A handful of gliders got in and nothing else did. What did arrive the afternoon before was a sentence relayed from the army coming up from the south, saying that a Christmas Eve present was on its way and to hold on. The 24th itself was quiet, and the word in the journals is exactly that. Every regiment in the town used it. The staffs, according to the record, officially took note of the date, which is the flattest way anyone has ever described a holiday. Divisional intelligence marked the date in its own medium, sending every command post in Bastogne an overlay in 3 colors. In red were the German positions, drawn all the way round until the ring closed. In green, written across the ground the division still held, were 2 words: Merry Christmas. There was a Christmas tree in the town, and it stood in a message center. The town was bombed twice in the night, and one of the bombs came into the headquarters where the tree was and knocked it over. The tree was stood back up at a chapel 1,000 years old, beside the castle, holding a regimental command post. The officers of a parachute regiment heard the Christmas Eve Mass, and their Belgian neighbors came in good numbers. The officers went to bed about 1:30. The German artillery preparation opened at 2:45. Further north, the meal ended and the work resumed. On the left of the First Army, the enemy looked ready to come on again, and after dinner 2 generals sat down to plan the evacuation of the Corps' heavy equipment, so the roads would be clear if the Corps had to go back. The dinner lasted exactly as long as dinner. South of the salient, the day was quiet, if you leave out the tank destroyers firing now and then across a river at movement on the far bank. For one infantry division, it was not a holiday at all. At 7:30 in the morning, the infantry climbed out of their frozen foxholes and attacked. On the other side of the line, the mail was a subject of report. The field postmaster of a German corps recorded a falling off in the Christmas mail reaching the front, and above all in the gift parcels. Their army newspaper ran a sour item about a shipment of caviar sent to a marshal by a Spanish restaurateur. A division commander hoped his men would recover their Christmas spirit once they were back behind the border works. What reached you instead of letters was rumor, and the volume is blunt about its value. Men came back through the villages with reports of the enemy directly behind them. Elsewhere his whereabouts were unknown, though rumor put him on every side. Information, the history says, carried no more weight than rumor. There was one other kind of mail, and the men named it themselves. Outgoing mail was what they called their own artillery going out over their heads, away toward the other side. It arrived on a schedule, unlike the letters, and everyone in the hole knew when it was due. So the truck is still out there, one of 10, permanently detached, looking for a division that keeps moving. It will find you in the rear, or it will not find you at all. Doctrine hands the letter over somewhere behind, with the hot food and the few hours. Out here, the mail that arrives on a schedule is the outgoing kind, over your head. Light comes late in that country in December, and it comes without ceremony. The dark thins. The trees separate themselves from each other. Somewhere down the line, a vehicle starts and does not stop again. You do not sit up. The first thing you move is your toes, one foot and then the other, inside whatever you have got on them, and you keep moving them until you can feel where they end. That order matters. Feet first, then hands, then the rest of you. If you had the chance to take your boots off before you lay down, you put them back on now, and they will be stiff. If you did not, you find out this morning what a night does to leather that went to sleep wet. Then the rifle. Then stand to. The whole line awake and looking outward at the hour when an attack would come, holding that until the light is honest enough to see by. And then, if the day is going to be kind, something hot. Coffee more often than anything else. Not because it is food, because holding a cup with both hands is the fastest way there is to make your fingers work again. That is the morning. Now here is what came of it. The army looked hard at that winter afterwards, and the first thing worth saying is that it did not find the answer it expected to find. The obvious story is a story about boots, the right winter footwear ordered too late, shipped too slowly, and arriving after the cold had done its work. All of that is true, and none of it turned out to be the main thing. The theater took that conclusion apart itself. In February, the quartermaster and the surgeon compared the one army that had received winter footwear, a full 60 days ahead of everyone else, against the rest of the front, and its numbers came out no better than average. They both wrote to Washington to correct their own earlier statements. The nature of the footwear, they said, was far from the main factor. Nothing about the supply story closes neatly either. Large sizes of overshoes did not catch up until March. A second order of winter boots, requested in December on the condition that it arrive by mid-February, had not been unloaded from the ships by mid-February, and very little of it ever reached the troops. In the second week of February, one army decided to go back to the old combination, the ordinary boot and the rubber overshoe. Because it had warmed up, and because the felt insoles and the heavy socks the new boots needed were the things it could not get. Supply caught up with the winter at about the time the winter ended. What did work was smaller and much less satisfying to write down. Spare socks carried against the body and changed once a day, more often if you could. Boots off when you lie down. Feet rubbed. Toes worked inside the boot whenever you were standing still. Hot food and hot drink as often as anyone could manage it. And a man pulled back a few hundred yards, for an hour or two, into a dugout or a tent or the cellar of a wrecked house, where he could get the wet off him and hold a cup. None of that is equipment. All of it is somebody deciding it will happen, and then checking that it did. So the fix, when it came, was not a thing. It was a line of people. A directive at the end of January put 2-man teams into each army, one line officer, one supply officer, whose entire job was to drive from headquarters to headquarters and teach it downward until it reached the sergeant, who was with his own men around the clock. That sergeant was the point of the whole apparatus. He was the only one close enough to see whose socks were wet. And it was late. The volume that records all this says so plainly. The teams were stood up too late to change the winter they were built for. By the time they were working properly, the weather was improving and the front was moving east. When they met again in Paris that April, the recommendation was the obvious one, arrived at expensively. If there is another winter campaign, start before the season, not during it. There was not another winter campaign. The forest is still there. The roads still run through it the way they ran then, and in December it still gets dark early. Sleep well. The long watch will be here tomorrow night.